Okay, so I'm really delighted to have Holly Niles back with me today on another episode, this time to discuss the truth energy. So I'm continuing through my series of podcasts and blogs and everything to do with the 7 essential energies, which many people know as chakras. And today we're talking about truth energy, which is our throat chakra. So this energy is all about speaking your truth, feeling like you have a voice, like you can make choices and you can voice them. It's really, but the speaking your truth. I love the words of Deanna Minnick, our teacher, who talks about coming from the heart, from your love energy and speaking your truth, speaking who you are out to the world through the throat. Anyway, so welcome, Holly. So Holly is a clinical nutritionist and also a yoga instructor, and I love that combination. And I'm really grateful that you agreed to come back on, Holly, and talk about truth today. So if we can start with, I guess, your thoughts about truth energy, the key concepts of it, you want to add things to what I've just mentioned before, and especially from your role as a nutritionist, how we can use nutrition to really activate the truth energy and also balance it, because that's really the key with what we're trying to do with working with these energies, is to have them in a balanced state. So thank you, Holly. Go for it.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again. And I always enjoy talking about any of the aspects, but the truth, is a powerful one, I think. You've already highlighted some of the aspects, when we think of choice, our voice, our authenticity. I think that even sometimes it's a phrase that gets used a lot, like, oh, be authentic, come from your authentic place. And I think, for lots of folks, it's a process to even have an idea, what does that actually mean? Because sometimes we're kind of channeling other people's voices, right? That we, beliefs and maybe things that came through our family. And I think that idea, certainly thinking of how Deanna speaks about coming from the heart, I think is about really getting centered in yourself and letting that be sort of that wisdom that really originates the truth. So we've got that sort of energetic part of it. And then we've got some of the practical things. If we think about the truth through nutrition, if we think about the throat, we think, juices, we're thinking, liquids, fruits, that sort of juicy moistness that comes with, liquids. And I think that's in itself, when we look at what people drink, it's kind of interesting. It can be through the nutrition lens, sometimes an area that we have to really focus on, because a lot of what people drink is not great for them. So when we think of, sodas, juices, like fruit juices, so high in sugar, sodas, of course, I think that's a pretty clear, area that most people would understand. We're having lots of sugar. And then I think, in the coffee world, right, we have that caffeine coffee world of a lot of these like very sweetened, those drinks with 4 and 5 names, the mocha latte, they'll have all these names after them. But when you actually look them up, whether we're talking about, common, chains, coffee shops and things, often we're talking about a lot of sugar. So I think that is a great place to start when we think of the truth and nutrition is what are you drinking, and when and why, and how do you make that shift? Certainly to water, we're going to think filtered water, the cleanest water you can get, broth, things like that. So I think that's a key piece. And then, we've got sort of that practical, we think of it like the sea vegetables, right? Or come into that realm of the truth, which have all these magical minerals, right? All these trace minerals, things that we don't often get from our food. So it's almost like a little elevated food, something to really concentrate, to bring in beyond, of course, our focus on just fruits and vegetables and the nutrition that comes from those. But I also think, and I was kind of reflecting on this, I also think there's quite a metaphor, because to me, the throat is kind of the bridge between the mouth and the rest of the body, certainly the GI system.
Yep.
And that's where that choice thing is very powerful, because we are making a choice, what we put in our mouth, right? There's that mindful piece. And once it crosses the bridge, we're committed, right? We're swallowing that food. It's still in the mouth. We could ostensibly go, I'm going to take that out, right? I don't know if I want to eat that. Yeah. But the throat is powerful because now we've crossed a bridge and now that food's going into our body. So I think there's also a way to think of the choice factor, choices and truth, with making mindful decisions about what we eat, what we actually take in our mouth, which of course then becomes, part of us.
And just because you brought it up, as soon as you said juice, I was like, yeah, but all the sugars in it. So when we talk about juices, what is the best way for people to think about juice in terms of being healthy, because it's not just sugars? So what are the best ways to put together a juice that is not just really the sugar from all the fruit?
Sure. Well, I think of a juice, we typically think of juice as green, right? Putting green vegetables. So to me, a juice, it has like kind of three components. We have sort of the water of a juice, which is for most people would be like celery or cucumber, that they're very juicy. They make a lot of liquid. And then there's all the goodness we're really trying to get in, which would be our greens, anything from like Swiss chard or spinach or dandelion or collard, some of the stronger greens. And then we have what I call the softening agents, which are lemon, lime, ginger, maybe like a green apple, a small green apple, to kind of just give a little softness to that flavor. And that to me is the way we would do a healthy juice. Mm-hmm. What is not a healthy juice is, I juiced, 8 carrots and 2 beets and 3 apples. So when we actually juice, we take all the fiber away. And so without the fiber, you're really concentrating the sugar in those particular vegetables and fruits. And to me, then it really kind of takes it out of a health food and into a bit more of like you're drinking a fruit juice in that sense, Okay. So that's kind of how I think of a juice. Mm-hmm. But I always have a caveat that when you make a green juice, which I make sometimes even for myself, it's never a substitute for eating veg. It's always a bonus, right? Because you've got these nutrients in a nice condensed form that give you these bonus nutrients, but I don't think it's a replacement ever for actually eating your vegetables. I think it's just an extra.
And is that because, as you mentioned, you're stripping away the fiber and that sort of thing? So you're obviously not getting the benefit of a whole food when you're just juicing it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, well said. That's it. Exactly.
Okay. All right. So I wanted to talk about the mouth, which you've already mentioned, and that is a wonderful analogy about the mouth being really where we make the choice. So the teeth obviously are a big component of how we start to digest our food, but I wanted to get from you the other aspects of the mouth as being the first part of the digestive system, and common problems that you might see. I assume that, you can even use the mouth to, like I know people in your kinds of professions will get someone to stick their tongue out and you can see that, even things like mineral deficiencies from that. So can you just talk to us a bit about the mouth?
Yeah, so the mouth is kind of fascinating because what we've learned in recent years, many people have heard about the gut microbiome, but we actually have an oral biome. So we have a variety of bacteria that live in the mouth. We also know that proper care of the teeth, one of the first conventional connections to having flossing our teeth and taking care of our teeth and gums was relative to cardiovascular disease, because they started to make connections that the plaque on our teeth becomes the plaque in our arteries. And so It's very close, right? The way your mouth works, everything's quite close to the brain. It gets into the bloodstream quite quickly because it's not moving through a lot of muscle and tissue. And so the microbiome is really important in the mouth, even just our bacteria. So there's sort of that, what we'll call sort of what lives there. And that, of course, we could have a sidebar conversation just about good oral health, right? Taking care of our teeth, flossing our teeth, making sure that even tongue scraping has been seen to be beneficial, right? To get rid of, some of that additional bacteria. Certainly never going to sleep, without brushing your teeth and letting that food. But then the other side of it is, even if we think about dental care, sometimes that can be itself a source of toxicity. So especially maybe, generations, maybe not so much what's happening now, but when we have older patients, they often have amalgam or silver mercury fillings. That can be a challenge, right? We can have leaching of that. We know that there's sometimes, not always, but there can be challenges, even things with like root canals and things that can create these pockets of bacteria. So the mouth is actually quite vital and active. And if your mouth is unhealthy, you're likely to be unhealthy. It's quite significant. So that's sort of like the environment. But then we have some of the biochemistry, which I think is what you're even thinking about, like in terms of the digestion and that piece. So there is some amylase. So there's an enzyme in the mouth that begins to break carbohydrates down, which is important. But then there's just the whole act of chewing, which, interestingly enough, people don't chew their food very well, right? We do a lot of quick chews, drinks. We don't realize, right? I'm eating quickly. I'm actually using my liquids to wash the food down. And that's quite significant for digestion, for your whole digestive system, because there's no teeth in your stomach. So if you don't make it happen in your mouth and really break that food down, what also happens is there's even like a neurological stimulation, even in the colon, to say, if chewing, it's like a little wake up that the whole GI system goes, oh, something's coming. Let's move out. Let's move the last food out. It's quite complex. Okay. And then, of course, when you chew well, then your stomach then, of course, has a really good opportunity to break your food down, which, of course, affects what happens next in terms of your overall digestion. So there's quite a significance to what happens in the mouth. And frankly, just slowing down eating, interestingly enough, can often make a huge improve in digestion just by that one act. So the mouth is, quite an anchor for the whole start of certainly the GI tract, when we kind of look at it in terms of simple lifestyle changes that you can make to improve your health.
Yeah. And do you use, actually, before I ask that question, what are your recommendations to people? So I've heard things like chew at least 10 times, at least 10 chews per bite. And also, actually, our colleague Paula recommended that people with a mouthful, that they put their, knife and fork down, or the food, like if it's a hamburger or whatever. Let's hope people aren't eating them too often, but they put whatever they're eating down, or however they're eating, what they're eating it with, down while they chew. Which is something that I've done a bit myself since she mentioned that. But is there anything else that you would say about trying to slow down the process of eating and chewing properly?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly putting your fork down in between, and you'll be surprised when you start to do it, how you don't do it. People are always amazed.
Yeah.
People eat in a rushed manner in front of screens, and they don't really pay attention. We've all had that experience. We go to lunch or dinner with our best friend we haven't seen in like a year, and it takes like an hour and a half to eat dinner, right? Because we're taking our time, we're talking, we're chewing, there's so much flow that we're not just shoving it down. So I think that's a part. Sometimes what I offer patients is, it's always a little tricky when you give somebody the guidance to count their chewing, because sometimes then it feels super mechanical. So it's a balance. But I will say to them, set a timer, and I want you to take I start them out at least 10 minutes to eat. And you would say, oh, 10 minutes, that's not long. But when you're a super fast eater, 10 minutes is an eternity.
Yep.
You can eat in like minutes. People can eat a sandwich in like 3 minutes. Like, it's quite amazing. You should time yourself at some point, especially when you're just kind of noshing on something. So I'll usually say that, like, see, can you stretch out that meal for 10, depending on where they're at, 10, 12, 15 minutes, just take longer to eat. And that will automatically have them putting down their fork or pausing for a moment, or also resisting big glasses of liquid at the meal, maybe having a small glass. And so then you start to also notice how much you're actually washing your food down, rather than just chewing and letting the natural juices of the mouth, be enough to create that to swallow.
And is there so obviously, okay, so we have just a small glass, but is there any other guidelines around drinking when you're eating?
Yeah, it's not ideal to drink a lot, because it can kind of dilute some of the gastric juices a little bit. So it's ideal to limit drinking. Ideally you would be drinking your water between your meals and things like that, and not using that time to have multiple glasses of anything, actually.
It's such a cultural thing though, isn't it? Like, you just kind of don't sit down at a table without a drink as well as the food. So it's something that people really need to start thinking about, and and even test it out for yourselves. Try not drinking anything with a meal and feeling whether you can notice the difference in the digestion.
Yeah, because we all know, if you've got like a 5-year-old or a young kid, and you take them to a restaurant and they want the drink, or they bring them the fancy drink, in the special cup, what always happens, right? They drink the whole thing, and then they're not hungry.
And they don't eat, yeah.
And then that's a classic, right? So I think there's something to that too, right?
Yep.
Is that it kind of can alter the whole process of feeling full and kind of tuning into your belly. So
great. And do you use the mouth as a tool to look at someone's overall nutritional health?
Yes, I have done that before. I think sometimes even as people talk, you can see, certainly gums that are unhealthy. There's definitely things you can read on the tongue, even just the look of the tongue, if the tongue is coated and things like that, there's some suggestion that perhaps that can speak to some dysbiosis in the gut, maybe things like yeast or candida. So yeah, I think there are definitely things that you can tell about somebody just by even having them open their mouth.
So do you recommend that people, regularly look at their own tongue?
I think it's interesting to do. Yeah. I mean, I think all those things, I think the better you know your body, and then you can note changes like, oh, wow, look how, or maybe if you're not feeling well, look at your tongue. That may be a way to do it. And then as you're feeling better, say, what has anything changed?
That's a great tip. Okay. And then I wanted to talk about mucus, because that's certainly a big thing with the throat. And I know that dairy can be a problem with mucus production. So I'd just love to get, I guess, why that is, the kind of the science behind that, and what your recommendations are around dairy for most people.
Yeah, so with dairy, it definitely can be mucus producing. There are maybe a few reasons why that could happen. There's some suggestion when it comes to dairy that it tends to just make phlegm thicker. because of the dairy, the fat in dairy, and it's just sort of naturally creates a thickness to phlegm that might already be there. But probably what I see more commonly is a food sensitivity. And so we'll see almost an inflammatory response from eating the dairy, which the immune system, there are many ways it can certainly inflame, but I would say sort of that histamine response or the mucus that will often come as a result of that, it might be on a spectrum. So for some people, they may eat it and get stuffed up immediately, where they'll literally feel almost like they have seasonal allergies. And that I would say is more of a histamine response, and histamines are part of your immune system. Most people have heard of antihistamines, right? These over-the-counter medications that turn those off, but they're a way of the body saying, you know what, I don't think this belongs here. I'm going to try to trap it right now, and I'm going to send out fluid, which becomes this mucus, to see if I can capture it and get it out so that it doesn't, make its way into the body in a way that's going to be more destructive. So dairy, certainly in my world, so I have more clients coming to me who have imbalances, who are struggling maybe with digestive issues or inflammatory conditions or autoimmunity. So it's a common food for me to eliminate for folks. One of the challenges that happens with dairy is, of course, how dairy is made, right? Where do we get our dairy from? Yeah. What is the health of the cows? That's a whole conversation itself. We know factory farm meat is really inflammatory because when you feed cows corn, everything changes in a cow. So I would say the same would be true of the milk. So, some people will tolerate like a pasture farmed kind of milk or, something that's a little cleaner, but I would say the majority of my clients don't handle dairy well, and it tends to be inflammatory. The other part of dairy too is that some of the proteins that are in dairy, like casein or whey, can be also very problematic in the gut. So sometimes they're very irritating and inflammatory to the gut as well. So it's often a food that I'm removing from clients, eating plans.
And what about the A1, A2 protein issue? Do you find that people can, if the protein is the problem, then just drinking the straight A2 milk can be okay?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've seen it work in a couple of cases, but I think there's still something about the cow's dairy and its inflammatory nature that certainly for people who have GI issues and a lot of gut issues, it just seems like they just do better without it.
Yeah. Okay. And what about goat or sheep dairy products? Is that a different matter for people?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There are different schools of thought. There's some people who go, nope, if it has a mother that their baby's drinking from, we have milk, it's dairy, right?
Yep.
I have found personally even, but certainly with clients, that sheep or goat will often be a little easier to digest. And the thinking behind that is if you take cow's milk and look at the macronutrient balance, the ratio of protein to carbs to fat, if you think about a cow, it has the nutrition to grow a calf into a huge cow, right?
Yeah,
and if you haven't ever been up close with a cow, they're massive, right? So if you take a sheep or a goat, and if you were to stand it up, if it could stand up, it's more the size of a human, right? It's more the size.
Interesting.
And so there's some thinking, and some people may have had instances even with newborn babies having maybe issue with mom's milk. Sometimes they'll even give them goat's milk. And that's because its macronutrient balance is a little more similar to human milk. And so maybe we handle it a little bit better. So I have had some success with people doing a little bit of goat cheese or, sheep cheese. Sometimes that works. And some people, but for some people, the whole kit and caboodle is just not great for, their gut overall.
Yeah. And I think what you said about what the, whatever product it is that we're eating, whether it's meat or dairy or even eggs, we are what we eat, but we are what we eats as well. So that whole thing of trying to find any food product that you want to consume that's coming from as clean a source as possible, that's being fed what it's naturally raised to eat, or what it would eat in the wild, which is, obviously not most of the animals or animal products we eat. But yeah, just really important for people to think about, because I think a lot of the time we just don't consider, whether even was that animal relatively happy when it was living. And, I believe that that's going to affect the quality, the energetic quality of the food, let alone, how the actual nutrients or the stress hormones that might be produced in that animal. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, and then the other big one with the throat is the thyroid, which many people have issues with. And I'm always amazed when I read about how so many people may have thyroid problems, but they're not aware of that fact. And it also seems to me that in Western medicine, a lot of the time, there's a different understanding of whether there is a problem with the thyroid than perhaps in a holistic or functional medicine practice. So I guess if you can give us a bit of a 101 on the thyroid and what it actually does and why it is so important to start with, that would be great.
Well, the thyroid's kind of like the ambassador for the truth, in the sense, right? It sits right here, right? It's a small gland. It's part of your endocrine system, which your pancreas is part of that, your adrenals. So these are organs that secrete hormones. So we're thinking of thyroid hormone. But sometimes they call it like a master gland because it controls metabolism. So the rate at which your body operates, everything from heartbeat to even the rate of your breathing, your weight, your temperature. It's a very powerful little organ as it sits. So we hear quite a lot about thyroid imbalances. You make a really good point. There's different schools of thought about that. There's a few ways your thyroid could be out of balance, but we tend to think the main ways are either hypothyroidism, which just means your thyroid's kind of sluggish and slow and not really doing its job, or hyperthyroidism, which means it is like dialed up. Somebody put the volume on high and it's kind of revving you up. And of course, the symptoms are quite similar to what you would think. So people tend to have, issues with their hair will fall out, their skin will feel dry, they'll be low energy. Sometimes I've seen people who feel like their throat is really dry, sometimes resistant weight. They just sort of feel like their engine got turned way down, versus hyper, which is usually the opposite, where people will feel shaky and hyper and, like their weight, they can't keep weight on. But I think the hypothyroid is what I see more commonly.
Yeah.
And then within hypothyroidism, we have a subset called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is actually autoimmune disease relative to the thyroid. And so the point you make about the diagnosing of that, typically from a conventional perspective, they're looking at one hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone that has this reference range. And if that's normal, generally there's no further conversation. Even if someone says, well, I feel like I'm tired or my hair's falling out. Nope, your TSH is fine, you're fine. And with respect to that world, it is what's considered standard of care. That's how thyroid imbalances are diagnosed through that lens. When we shift to a functional or integrative perspective, we're saying, well, wait a minute, there's quite a complexity here. There's this whole way, you know, we go from T3 to T4, and there's reverse T3, and then there's thyroid antibody potential. So we're looking at several values where we may see, oh, T3 is off or T4 is off, or we'll also measure for antibodies, which means that your body is actually making antibodies against your thyroid, thinking it's a foreigner. And so that is really why we have a lot of folks who, you know, I've certainly seen folks who've been in a conventional environment for a while and said, I feel like something's off, come into a functional perspective and then get that test and they go, yes, your thyroid is off, or you have antibodies and no one checked it. So that's a pretty common scenario, you know, and it's very frustrating, of course, for patients when they kind of feel that and just feel like it's hard to get that next layer of testing done.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is something that I'm personally going through at the moment. And I think I'm on to my third practitioner, and I think I've had, you know, at least 4 different lots of testing. And, you know, you've just got to persevere. And if you know that something isn't right with you, then don't let go of that and wait until, don't wait, you know, make sure that you get somebody who's going to go through all the testing that you need. And just for people who don't know, so T3 and T4 are 2 of the other thyroid hormones that the levels will be checked. So yeah, really, it is really, really important, and it's a big issue. It seems like, you know, there's a huge proportion of the population, especially women, I think, are especially prone. So yeah, you know, just get it checked out properly, people.
Well, what's also interesting when you say that, though, Arwen, if you want to think energetically, right? If you think about stereotypically, let's say culturally, you know, maybe women not finding their voices, right? Not speaking. It's interesting to go, okay, so here we have a group that maybe has could have some issues with being authentic or voicing. And then that group is having an imbalance rate where that lives. So I think I always find that very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that. That's so true. All right. So, and I just had a little question that I wanted to ask you, because when we talk about these systems, we're talking about energy, and energy is on a particular vibration. And so each of these energies will be represented in the color spectrum because that energy is equated to that color on the vibrational level. And with truth energy, we're looking at aquamarine or turquoise. With all the other colors, it's pretty easy to think of foods. You know, we can think of red foods and yellow foods and orange foods, etc. But is there an aquamarine whole food?
I have not found one.
No.
I've seen maybe some algae. I've seen some things maybe in that spectrum. So, you know, we tend to lean, but if we think about the sea vegetables, which is where we tend to focus, there definitely are, if you think of what happens in the sea, you know, I always wonder, well, there's quite a color spectrum, and perhaps there's, you know, in those foods, there's colors we don't even see when we do that. But I honestly, anything that is aquamarine that you find in a store that's true aquamarine, probably not a food you want to eat. True. No. When you see that clear, you know, bright aquamarine, it's usually a food coloring. So no, I haven't really found one that's that authentically aquamarine.
So you've mentioned the sea vegetables. Now, this is something that certainly in Western culture is not a common food at all. I mean, I guess most people will have been exposed to seaweed in Japanese food, in sushi. But what are these sea vegetables, and where can we find them, and how do we use them as foods for ourselves?
Yeah, so there's several. There's kelp, there's nori, there's different ones. How I have people do them, which I think is the easiest, is you can actually buy like dulse flakes, which are almost a little salty. You can do that with some of the seaweeds, will come almost like some of them. There's one that comes or something, it's a little Japanese combination called gomasio, which is ground sesame seeds with some seaweed in it. That's really flavorful. So I feel like putting it, sprinkling it on food is a really easy way to get it in if you're not going to become, an expert. There's certainly kombu is a seaweed that for many years people would use. There was some suggestion if you're like slow cooking a legume, that if you add some kombu in it as a seaweed, it actually sort of helps break down the lectins. It makes them a little less gassy for people.
I've heard that. Okay.
That's one. As a matter of fact, even there's even some companies who make like organic canned beans that there are a few brands that actually have kombu in their beans.
Okay. Maybe we don't have that much here. I'm not sure.
But yeah, I think that's really the best way to do it. Now, if you're somebody who likes seaweed, there's been quite a popularity with these seaweed snacks, like these little sheets of seaweed.
Yeah.
So some people like those. The trick of those is that they often use very poor quality oils in those seaweeds. So you really want to read your label. I recently found one that was organic with some avocado oil, which would be a much higher quality. So that can be a little bit problematic, but that's where I've seen it be the easiest, is just keep some dulse, keep something in a little shaker. Maybe if you make a salad or even on your veggies, because it's a nice taste. It's a little salty, and it's a good source of minerals and iodine, which of course is super important for the thyroid.
Yeah.
So,
yep. And is what's the latest on iodine as far as are most people pretty low in iodine in the Western world?
Yeah, I think it's something that isn't tested a lot. I'm not sure even always in functional testing. I think it's probably safe to say that the only place people get iodine is through iodized salt.
Yep.
Right. So salt was added to iodine generations ago for goiters and these, thyroid imbalances, which we don't see so much anymore. So I think it's safe to assume that probably most people are a little deficient. And so that's why I think if you're just sort of trying to add those sea vegetables, sometimes you can even take some trace minerals. You can buy them in a liquid and things as well that you could add. But I think just having those sort of visit your meal even a few times a week is probably a good way to just ensure that you're getting a source of iodine.
And also sea salt. So that was another thing I learned recently for myself. I was always using that Himalayan, the pink salt, which is great for particular minerals and stuff as well, but then there's no iodine in it. Whereas if you're using sea salt, it's got the natural iodine. Is that right?
Yes, you're correct about that. Yeah. And I had heard that recently too, that pink salt is pretty. And people have been thinking, wow, this is a whole unique kind of, source of minerals, but, perhaps having a combination is good, right? Doing a bit of both.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, I just bought this big, massive, 5-kilo container of Himalayan salt. So now I'm using it in the bath. So all right.
Get your minerals in one way or the other, right?
Yeah, exactly. So are there any other truth energy foods that you want to mention that we haven't already talked about, Holly?
Well, I think some of the ideas of bone broths and things like that we've seen, right? So that's certainly perhaps making your own is ideal, although there are quite a variety of companies that will do that. So bone broth is a nice liquid. It has a lot of nutrition, and of course in many ways a bone broth is really an ancient food. So most cultures have a grandma or some memory of someone who took whether it was like oxtail or a chicken, and cooked it and made this like amazingly savory, delicious soup with a whole chicken, right? The whole carcass. And that's really becoming a form of a bone broth. So I think those are a nice thing, to add for gut health and collagen. There's a lot of good health benefits, I think, to adding bone broths as a truth.
And so what is the difference between bone broth and stock?
Well, stock is usually can be made just from the chicken itself, as I understand it, as opposed to actually cooking the bones until they're, there's a focus on creating the broth from the bones rather than the meat.
Right.
And so it's a little bit more, it's slightly more labor intensive, right? And it does not produce as much.
And they're uncooked bones, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Although I think I'm always about being flexible. And so if I make organic chicken and like I make roast chicken, I always save my carcasses. I always freeze them, and I will take them out and put, gather a few, and I'll cook, those bones up and make a broth even from that. Maybe the purest form is to start, fresh with uncooked bones, but I think that's a reasonable compromise.
Yeah, I mean, I do that too, but I would call that stock. Like if I've roasted a chicken and then I make a broth, but it's, I would call it a stock because it's already cooked. I don't know. Maybe that's the difference. Who knows? Anyway, it's all good for you.
Yes, indeed.
And also you're using, absolutely every bit of the animal, and you can use all your, another thing that I've started doing recently is when you're chopping, the tops off your carrots or whatever, then put all that stuff in the freezer for when you do want to make a stock, rather than, then you're using all those end bits that have still got so much nutrition to them, but we tend to just throw them away, but they're great for making stock.
Yes, it's a great tip.
Okay, so I think that was mainly what I wanted to cover with you, Holly, but I just wanted to get from you to finish up any, top 3 tips maybe for people to nourish, nurture and look after their truth energy from your perspective as a clinical nutritionist.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really important, which we had talked about a little bit, is kind of trusting your voice and maybe taking baby steps to learning to speak it. Sometimes it can feel really risky if you're somebody who's like kind of a people pleaser and you don't really speak up. You feel like, oh my gosh, I could never just start saying that. But I think just saying no to things, or just taking a risk to say, I think I'm just going to try this. What if I say this? I think that's incredibly powerful, because I think that really speaks to just overall just health and wellness and, stress reduction and all of those things. So I think that's a key part in terms of sort of the energetic part of it, or we'll call like the psycho-spiritual part of it. I think, taking care of the mouth and the teeth and the throat, as we talked about, being mindful with the liquids you have, even just the care of the mouth, I think is really important. It really is such a powerful part of health. And then I'm a fan of minerals. I think we often are deficient in minerals. So taking the time, we talked a lot about the sea vegetables, but really having that, theme kind of run through, making sure during a week that you're doing that. I think for lots of people, it can really improve their health, because it will create, we don't necessarily have diagnoses that are like, oh, this person, with the exception of perhaps maybe iodine, we don't go, oh, they're manganese deficient or something. Yeah. But we know that often when we bring them in, it'll just sort of dial health up a little bit, where people will be like, I feel like I feel better. And I think it closes the gap, in subtle ways that I think can be really significant for overall health, and even just preventing imbalances down the road.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Because I think we need to remember as well that, especially in countries like ours, where there's been, really extensive farming, that our soil is really depleted of minerals. So it is, a lot of people will just think that they can get everything from their food, and ideally we would get everything from our food, but unfortunately sometimes you've got to have more of particular foods, but also potentially look at specific things like we said, the sea salt or the dulse flakes to help us get particular minerals that we're low in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for speaking truth with me today, Holly. If you could just maybe remind people where they can find you, because I know you do online consultations, so it doesn't really matter where people are in the world, they can reach out to you. And what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, they can find me on my website, which is quite easy. It's just my name, hollyniles.com. If they want to, send me a note, an email, it's easy, info@hollyniles.com. Or I do have a business line that's 860-266-5866, and that's in the US. So.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And I hope you have a lovely evening, and really appreciate you giving us your time and your wisdom today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.